In May of 1996, Julie Williams and Lai Winans packed their backpacks, anticipating what should have been a liberating week in Virginia's Shenandoah National Park. Two young women deeply in love with the outdoors, they brought along their golden retriever, Taj, and visions of the trails that lay ahead. Their families were expecting to hear from them by May 28th. Those calls never happened. When Taj wandered back alone on May 30th, hope quickly turned to fear. Days later, searchers tragically discovered Julie and Lai's bodies near Skyline Drive. They had been bound, gagged, and brutally murdered, a discovery that shattered families and destroyed any sense of safety within the wilderness. For 28 long years, their killer remained free while their families silently carried the weight of their grief. The FBI exhaustively pursued thousands of leads. In 2002, they made an arrest, but it was the wrong man. The charges were dropped, and hope once again faded. Then, in 2021, advances in modern DNA technology reopened the case. The revelation of the killer's identity shocked everyone. Walter Leo Jackson Sr., a serial rapist, had died in prison years earlier, seemingly beyond the reach of justice. The question haunted investigators. How had they missed him for nearly 3 decades? Before we dive into the details, leave a comment sharing your favorite camping spot or the most recent place you explored. The morning sun streamed through the ancient oak trees as Julie Williams made a final adjustment to her backpack straps. May 19th, 1996 marked the beginning of a week-long hiking adventure through Shenandoah National Park, a trip she and Lai had been planning for months. At 24, Julie exuded a quiet confidence, her Minnesota upbringing evident in her practical gear choices and the warm smile that had charmed friends since childhood. "Are you sure we have everything?" Julie asked, going through their mental checklist. One last time. Her methodical nature was the perfect complement to Lai's spontaneous energy. Lai Winans bounced on her toes, unable to contain her excitement. At 26, she had found in Julie not only a romantic partner, but also someone who shared her profound, almost spiritual connection to wild places. Their golden retriever, Taj, wagged his tail between them, sensing the adventure ahead. The dog, Julie's loyal companion for the past 3 years, had accompanied her on countless hiking trips across the Midwest. "Ready for this, boy?" Julie scratched behind Taj's ears, using the gentle tone she reserved for animals and children. 7 days of pure freedom ahead of us. The couple had met 18 months prior through mutual friends at an environmental education conference in Minneapolis. Both women worked in fields that connected them deeply to nature. Julie worked in environmental advocacy for a nonprofit focused on wilderness preservation, while I was an outdoor educator teaching urban children about forest ecosystems. They soon discovered a shared longing to escape the increasingly crowded cities and find solace in places where silence spoke louder than noise, where cell phones couldn't reach, and where the only schedules were dictated by sunrise and sunset. Their early conversations revealed strikingly similar childhoods, spent exploring woods and streams. Julie had grown up near Minnesota's Boundary Waters, learning to canoe before she could even ride a bicycle. Lai's upbringing included summers camping with her grandfather, an old woodsman who taught her to read animal tracks and identify edible plants. Both women understood that the wilderness offered something cities never could, a sense of peace that came from belonging to something larger than human concerns. They carefully loaded their meticulously organized gear into Julie's reliable Honda Civic, checking items off a typed list Julie had prepared weeks in advance: sleeping bags, tent, camp stove, water purification tablets, first aid kit, topographical maps, a compass, and extra batteries for their flashlights. Julie firmly believed in preparation, while Lai trusted in adaptability. Together, they formed an effective team. The drive from Julie's Minneapolis apartment to Shenandoah took them through Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and finally Virginia. They took turns driving, sharing stories, playing word games, and discussing their planned route through the park. The radio played softly, featuring classic rock, folk music, and occasional news updates that seemed increasingly irrelevant as they drove farther from urban centers. First night near Skyland Resort, Julie read from their itinerary. Then we'll head south along the Appalachian Trail toward Rocky Top. After that, we'll see how we feel and where the trail takes us. Lai smiled at her partner's organized approach. As long as Taj gets to swim in some streams and we get to see some stars without city lights, I'm happy. Neither woman had any idea that their careful planning was being watched. They couldn't know that predatory eyes were already observing the hiking trails, searching for isolated targets. Evil rarely announces itself with warning signs or obvious threats. It often wears ordinary faces and follows normal routines until the moment it reveals its true nature. The Honda pulled into Shenandoah National Park on a perfect May afternoon. Spring had painted the Blue Ridge. Mountains in countless shades of green. Dogwood trees displayed white blossoms like scattered confetti. The air carried the sweet scent of honeysuckle and pine needles warming in the afternoon. Sunshine. Julie paid the entrance fee while I studied park brochures, and Taj pressed his nose against the car window, eager to explore new territory. Their first campsite was everything they had hoped for. A cleared area near Skyland Resort that provided easy access to facilities while still maintaining a sense of wilderness solitude. They pitched their two-person tent with practiced efficiency, Lai handling stakes and guidelines, while Julie ensured proper site selection and drainage. Taj immediately began investigating interesting scents, his tail wagging constantly as he cataloged the complex olfactory landscape of his new environment. That evening, they cooked a simple meal on their camp stove and watched the breathtaking sunset paint the Shenandoah Valley in shades of gold and purple. Julie captured the scene with her film camera, trying to preserve moments that seemed too beautiful to trust to memory alone. Lai sat cross-legged on their sleeping bags, writing in the leather-bound journal she carried on all their trips. "What are you writing?" Julie asked, settling beside her partner. "Just trying to describe this feeling," Lai replied, gesturing toward the view. "How do you put into words the way silence sounds different in the mountains? How do you explain why watching shadows move across valleys makes you feel connected to something eternal?" Julie understood completely. They had discussed this phenomenon many times. The way wilderness experiences seem to touch something deeper than ordinary consciousness, creating memories that felt more vivid and meaningful than most daily life experiences. As darkness settled over the mountains, they crawled into their tent with Taj curled up between them. The dog's warm presence and steady breathing provided comfort in the vast darkness of the forest. Julie and Lai talked quietly about their plans for the following day, then gradually drifted into the deep sleep that comes from physical exertion and mountain air. They couldn't know that somewhere in those same mountains, Walter Leo Jackson Sr. was making his own preparations for the days ahead. The 49-year-old drifter had been moving between Ohio and Virginia for several weeks, living out of his vehicle, avoiding law enforcement attention, and observing the patterns of hikers and campers in Shenandoah. Jackson was a predator with decades of experience in violence against women. He knew how to identify vulnerable targets, how to approach without raising suspicion, and how to ensure his crimes occurred in places where screams couldn't be heard. May 20th dawned clear and warm. Julie and Lai efficiently broke camp, leaving no trace of their overnight stay except for flattened grass that would recover within days. They planned to hike south along established trails, covering 8 to 10 miles before setting up their second campsite near a stream marked on their topographical map. The hiking was glorious. Spring wildflowers carpeted the forest floor in patches of purple, yellow, and white. Taj trotted ahead of them on the trail, occasionally disappearing into the underbrush to investigate interesting scents before returning to check on his humans. Julie and Lai walked hand in hand when the trail was wide enough, separating only when they encountered other hikers, or when the terrain demanded single-file travel. They met several other hiking parties during the day, a retired couple from Pennsylvania celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary with a week-long backpacking trip, a group of college students from Virginia Tech on a geology field study, and a solitary older man with a massive backpack who nodded politely as they passed. All encounters were friendly, brief, and unremarkable. The hiking community generally maintained an informal code of mutual assistance and respect for shared wilderness experiences. By late afternoon, they reached their intended campsite near a creek that provided fresh water and the pleasant sound of running water over rocks. They set up their tent, prepared dinner, and spent the evening reading, writing, and talking by the light of their camp lantern. Taj explored the immediate area thoroughly before settling near the tent entrance, unconsciously positioning himself as a guardian. May 21st followed a similar pattern. Morning coffee and oatmeal, careful packing of gear, and several hours of hiking through increasingly spectacular mountain scenery. They were moving deeper into the backcountry now, encountering fewer other hikers. The trails were well-maintained, but more challenging, with steeper climbs and rockier terrain. Julie took photographs of Lai sitting on a large boulder with the Shenandoah Valley spread out below them. Lai wrote longer journal entries, trying to capture details of their experiences that might fade from memory over time. Taj seemed to grow more confident and alert with each day in the wilderness, his domesticated golden retriever genetics awakening older instincts inherited from wild ancestors. That evening, they camped near a natural pool fed by a small waterfall. Taj immediately waded into the clear water, drinking deeply and then simply standing in the cool stream with obvious pleasure. Julie and Lai removed their hiking boots and soaked their feet while discussing their route options for the following day. We could take the connector trail over to Rocky Top, Julie suggested, studying their map by lantern light. Or we could continue south along the ridge. Both options look beautiful. Let's decide tomorrow morning, Lai replied. See how we feel. Check the weather. Maybe ask other hikers if we meet any. Neither woman felt any sense of approaching danger. They had encountered no threatening situations, met only friendly fellow hikers, and felt completely comfortable in the wilderness environment. Their careful preparation and hiking experience had given them confidence in their ability to handle normal backcountry challenges. But they were not prepared for the kind of human evil that Walter Leo Jackson represented. May 22nd began with a disagreement about their route. Julie preferred the efficiency of staying on established trails, while Lai wanted to explore a less-traveled connector path that appeared on their topographical map, but wasn't clearly marked on Park Service trail signs. They resolved the conflict democratically, as they always did, by compromising. They would try Lai's preferred route, but would turn back if the trail became difficult to follow. The connector trail proved challenging, but beautiful, winding through dense forest and across several small streams. Taj seemed to enjoy the more adventurous terrain, leaping across creek beds and investigating fallen logs with increased enthusiasm. The trail was definitely less maintained than the main hiking routes, requiring more careful attention to trail markers and topographical navigation. By midday, they had worked their way into a particularly remote section of the park. The forest felt ancient here, with massive oak and chestnut trees that had probably been growing since before European settlement. The silence was profound, broken only by bird calls, rustling leaves, and the distant sound of running water. That afternoon, they encountered the last people who would see them alive. Bob and Martha Henderson, retirees from Richmond, were hiking the same connector trail in the opposite direction. The meeting occurred at a small clearing where the trail crossed a rocky stream. Greetings were exchanged, route information was shared, and brief pleasantries were discussed about the beautiful weather and excellent hiking conditions. "You've picked a perfect week for backpacking," Bob Henderson commented, adjusting his baseball cap to shield his eyes from the afternoon sunlight filtering through the forest canopy. "It's been absolutely wonderful," Julie replied, her face glowing with the satisfaction that comes from days of physical activity in beautiful surroundings. We're from Minnesota and Maine, so we don't get to see mountains like this very often. Martha Henderson admired Taj, who was drinking from the stream while keeping one eye on his humans. He's a beautiful dog. Does he enjoy hiking? He loves it more than we do. Lai laughed, watching their golden retriever explore the rocky creek bed. Sometimes I think he'd rather live in the woods permanently. The Hendersons shared information about trail conditions ahead and recommended a particularly scenic overlook about 2 miles farther along the route. The conversation lasted perhaps 10 minutes before both parties continued on their respective journeys. Bob and Martha Henderson would later tell investigators that Julie and Lai appeared completely normal during their brief encounter. Both women seemed happy, healthy, and well prepared for their wilderness adventure. Nothing in their behavior or appearance suggested any awareness of danger or concern about their safety. Taj appeared alert and friendly, showing no signs of distress or unusual behavior. That evening, Julie and Lai established what would be their final campsite in a secluded area near the overlook the Hendersons had recommended. The location was breathtakingly beautiful but dangerously isolated. No other hiking parties were visible in any direction. The nearest established campground was several miles away. Cell phone coverage was non-existent. They cooked dinner as the sun set behind distant ridges, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Julie took several photographs of the sunset, though she would never live to have the film developed. Lai wrote extensively in her journal, trying to capture the spiritual experience of being completely alone with nature and the person she loved. Taj seemed more alert than usual that evening, occasionally raising his head to stare into the darkness beyond their campfire's light. Both women noticed his behavior, but attributed it to normal dog responses to unfamiliar sounds and scents in a new environment. Golden retrievers were not typically guard dogs, but Taj had always been protective of Julie and had extended that protectiveness to include Lai. Somewhere in the darkness beyond their campfires, Walter Leo Jackson was watching them. Jackson had been tracking hiking parties for several days, looking for the right combination of vulnerability and isolation. A solitary female hiker would have been ideal, but he had learned to be flexible in his targeting. 2 women camping alone in an extremely remote location represented an opportunity he couldn't pass up, especially with no other hikers visible anywhere in the area. Jackson was a methodical predator. He had spent decades perfecting techniques for approaching victims without alerting them to danger. He understood how to move quietly through wilderness terrain, how to observe without being observed, and how to strike at moments when resistance would be most difficult. The attack probably occurred in the early hours of May 23rd, while Julie and Lai slept in their tent. Jackson likely approached their campsite during the darkest hours before dawn, when human senses are naturally at their lowest alertness levels. Taj might have heard or smelled the approaching danger, but Jackson was experienced in dealing with animals as well as humans. What happened next can only be reconstructed from physical evidence found weeks later by investigators. Jackson overpowered both women, binding them with their own rope and clothing. The sexual assault and murder occurred at their isolated campsite. Far from any possibility of help or rescue, Jackson's methodology revealed careful planning and experience with similar crimes. He used materials found at the campsite rather than bringing obvious weapons that might be traced back to him. He attempted to conceal the bodies by covering them with camping gear and natural debris. Most importantly, he left Taj alive, possibly because killing the dog might have created additional evidence, or perhaps because he felt no particular animosity toward animals. After completing his horrific crimes, Jackson probably spent considerable time at the murder scene, ensuring he had left no obvious evidence that might lead investigators back to him. He may have used items from Julie and Lai's camping gear before abandoning them. He certainly removed anything that might provide forensic evidence of his identity. Then he vanished back into the wilderness, leaving behind 2 murdered women, their traumatized dog, and a crime scene that would baffle investigators for nearly 3 decades. Taj remained at the campsite for unknown hours, or possibly days, after witnessing his humans' murders. The golden retriever was found several days later in a state of obvious distress, wandering trails miles from where Julie and Lai had been killed. Animal behavior experts later theorized that Taj had stayed near the bodies until hunger, thirst, and confusion finally drove him to search for help in the only way available to him, by wandering toward areas where other humans might be found. The dog's survival created one of the most heartbreaking elements of the entire tragedy. Taj had witnessed everything but could never testify about what he had seen. He had survived his humans' murder but would carry psychological scars for the remainder of his life. May 28th came and went without the expected phone calls home. Julie's parents, Tom and Patty Williams, sat by their telephone in their Minneapolis suburb, checking and rechecking the answering machine that remained stubbornly silent. "She always calls," Tom Williams told his wife for the 10th time that day. "Julie has never missed a check-in call. Not once in all her hiking trips." Patty Williams tried to maintain optimism while fighting growing dread. Maybe they found a spot without phone service. Maybe they decided to stay an extra day or two. You know how she gets when she's really enjoying herself outdoors. But parental instincts rarely lie. Deep in their hearts, both Tom and Patty Williams sensed that something was terribly wrong. Julie was methodical, responsible, and considerate of her parents' concerns about her wilderness adventures. She had never failed to call when she promised to call. In Unity, Maine, Lai's parents experienced identical growing dread. Their daughter was equally responsible about communication during hiking trips. Her silence felt unnatural, ominous, and completely out of character. Lai's mother, Patricia Winans, called Julie's parents in Minneapolis on May 29th. The conversation was brief, but confirmed both families' worst fears. Neither household had received any communication from the women since they had entered Shenandoah National Park. "I think we need to call the Park Service," Patricia Winans suggested. "Something isn't right." Tom Williams agreed. "Immediately. I'll call them right now." Julie would never leave us worrying like this unless something was preventing her from calling. The initial contact with Shenandoah National Park headquarters was frustrating for the families. Park rangers explained that adult visitors were not required to check in regularly, and that communication gaps were common in remote wilderness areas, where cell phone coverage was spotty or non-existent. They suggested waiting another day or two before assuming there was an actual emergency. But by May 30th, the family's persistence had convinced park officials to take their concerns seriously. Rangers began checking recent camping permits and talking to other hikers who might have encountered Julie and Lai during their trip. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source late on May 30th. Ken and Susan Miller, experienced hikers from Washington, D.C., were exploring trails near Skyline Resort when they encountered a golden retriever wandering alone. Obviously distressed and confused, the dog wore a collar, but no leash, and seemed friendly but agitated, as if searching for someone who couldn't be found. The Millers immediately recognized the significance of finding a solo dog in Shenandoah's backcountry. Dogs didn't backpack alone. Someone was missing, probably in trouble, possibly in serious danger. He kept looking back toward the denser forest, Susan Miller later told investigators. He would walk with us for a few hundred yards, then stop and look back like he expected familiar faces to catch up with him. It was heartbreaking. Ken Miller described the dog as muddy, tired, and obviously distressed, but not injured or starving. He had been on his own for a while, but not for weeks, maybe days. He was thirsty and hungry, but not desperate. The Millers brought Taj to park headquarters, where rangers immediately checked the dog's identification tags and connected him to the missing persons reports filed by worried families in Minnesota and Maine. Park Superintendent Robert Reynolds authorized an immediate search and rescue operation. By evening on May 30th, helicopters were circling overhead while ground teams spread across the mountainous terrain where Julie and Lai had planned to hike. The search operation quickly grew into one of the largest wilderness rescue efforts in Shenandoah's history. Local fire departments provided volunteers. Virginia State Police offered helicopter support. FBI agents from the Richmond Field Office joined the effort when it became apparent that the missing persons case might involve foul play. Tom Williams and his wife drove frantically from Minneapolis toward Virginia, making the trip in record time while clinging to hope that Julie and Lai might be found injured but alive somewhere in the wilderness. Lai's parents made similar desperate journeys from Maine. All four parents focused on best-case scenarios while privately preparing for devastating news. The search intensified on June 1st as more volunteers joined professional rescue teams. Dozens of people spread across miles of dense forest and rocky terrain, calling out names and checking every possible location where two women might have sought shelter or been trapped by injury. Local media picked up the story, broadcasting descriptions of two missing hikers and their golden retriever. Television helicopters joined the search from above, while newspaper reporters interviewed family members and park officials about the growing rescue operation. The hiking community responded with immediate support. Other backpackers postponed their own trips to join the search efforts. Outdoor gear companies donated equipment and supplies. Social media networks, which were just beginning to emerge in the mid-1990s, spread information about the missing women across hiking and LGBTQ+ communities nationwide. Then, around midday on June 1st, a search team working the area near Skyland Resort made the discovery that would shatter two families and traumatize an entire community. Search and rescue volunteer David Polson was working with his trained search dog when they encountered an unusual scent signature in a secluded area several hundred yards off the main hiking trail. Polson's dog, a German Shepherd trained in human remains detection, showed intense interest in a particular location where natural debris and camping equipment appear to have been deliberately arranged to conceal something underneath. Polson immediately called for backup before approaching the suspicious area. His training and experience had taught him to preserve potential crime scenes until law enforcement officers could properly document any evidence. When sheriff's deputies and FBI agents arrived at the scene, they confirmed Polson's worst fears. Julie Williams and Lai Winans had been found, but they were far beyond rescue. The crime scene was horrific enough to traumatize experienced investigators. Both women had been bound with rope and clothing from their own camping gear. Both had been sexually assaulted before being murdered. The killer had attempted to conceal the bodies under camping equipment and natural debris, but animals and decomposition had disturbed his efforts. Physical evidence suggested the murders had occurred several days earlier, probably within a day or two of the women's last confirmed sighting by the Henderson couple. The isolated location meant their screams could not have been heard by other hikers or campers. What struck investigators most powerfully was the calculated, methodical nature of the crime. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence or a random encounter gone wrong. Someone had specifically targeted Julie and Lai, overpowered them both despite their physical fitness and outdoor experience, and executed them with deliberate cruelty. The killer had used materials. Rather than bringing weapons that could be traced back to him, the perpetrator seemed to have relied on items available at the campsite. The amount of time he spent at the murder scene indicated a level of confidence that he wouldn't be disturbed. Perhaps the most perplexing aspect of the case was that he left Taj, the dog, alive and unharmed, even though the animal was clearly a witness to the crime. Sheriff's deputies faced the heartbreaking task of notifying the victims' families, while FBI agents began the meticulous process of collecting evidence from the crime scene. The phone calls to Minnesota and Maine were as devastating as they were necessary. Tom Williams answered his phone at a motel in Virginia, where he was assisting with search efforts. When the sheriff's deputy delivered the news, Tom was utterly crushed, overcome by a grief and horror no parent should ever have to experience. "No," he whispered into the phone, his voice barely audible. "No, that can't be right. You're supposed to be rescuing them, not finding them dead." Patty Williams took the phone from her husband's trembling hands and listened in stunned silence as the deputy shared the limited details available so early in the investigation. Her daughter, the adventurous young woman who had brought so much joy and vitality into their lives, had been murdered by someone embodying pure evil. Similar, equally devastating phone calls were made to Lolly's family in Maine. Parents who had clung to hope for their daughter's rescue for days were now forced to confront the brutal reality that she had been killed in the wilderness she cherished. The news spread beyond immediate circles, reaching the wider community through media reports that started cautiously but quickly escalated as more details of the gruesome crime emerged. The hiking community was aghast. LGBTQ+ advocates were furious. Shenandoah National Park, once a symbol of safety and natural beauty for countless visitors, was now associated with murder and terror. Within hours of the discovery, candlelight vigils began popping up in cities across the nation. Hikers gathered at trailheads to remember Julian Lee's life. LGBTQ+ organizations organized memorial services and demanded justice for what appeared to be a hate crime fueled by prejudice against lesbian women. Signs declaring justice for Julie and Lai appeared at hiking spots from Maine to California. The victims became symbols not just of wilderness tragedy, but of broader fears about violence against women and minorities in remote areas where help couldn't arrive in time. But while communities mourned and demanded justice, investigators were launching the painstaking process of identifying the killer. FBI Special Agent Patricia Morrison, a veteran with decades of experience in violent crime cases, took charge of the federal investigation, facing what seemed like one of the most horrific murders in Shenandoah's history. Morrison knew that the initial days of any homicide investigation were critical for gathering physical evidence and obtaining witness statements before time could compromise vital information. Morrison's team immediately began meticulously processing the crime scene, employing the most advanced techniques available in 1996. Every detail was documented with photographs. Evidence was carefully collected, cataloged, and preserved. Biological samples were gathered for the limited DNA analysis possible at the time. The investigation faced immediate obstacles. The crime had taken place in a very remote location, making it unlikely that other hikers had witnessed any suspicious activity. The victims had been dead for several days before they were discovered, leading to decomposition and animal activity that could compromise potential evidence. Perhaps most frustratingly, forensic technology in 1996 was rudimentary compared to the techniques that would be developed in the following decades. Still, the investigators systematically pursued every possible lead. They interviewed the Henderson couple at length about their encounter with Julie and Lee. They tracked down every other hiker who had registered camping permits for the relevant period. They expanded their investigation to include park employees, local residents, and anyone else who might have had access to the isolated area where the murders occurred. Early theories heavily emphasized the possibility that Julian and Lee had been specifically targeted because they were a lesbian couple. Hate crimes against LGBTQ+ individuals were tragically common in the 1990s, and the brutal nature of the murders suggested personal animosity rather than simple robbery or opportunistic violence. This theory was supported by the fact that nothing of value had been stolen from the women's campsite. Their camera, camping equipment, and small amount of cash were all left at the scene. The killers seemed to have been driven by violence itself, not material gain. Special Agent Morrison structured the investigation around multiple working theories, but the hate crime angle received priority attention and resources. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit developed psychological profiles of potential suspects, focusing on individuals with histories of violence against women and demonstrated hostility towards LGBTQ+ people. Thousands of tips poured into the investigation hotline established within days of the murders. Most proved useless, but each required follow-up to determine its relevance. Investigators tracked down reports of suspicious individuals in the park, unusual vehicles, and any behavior that might be connected to the crime. The investigation consumed enormous resources and generated thousands of pages of documentation. But solid leads remain elusive. The killer had vanished, leaving no obvious traces that could be followed using 1996 forensic capabilities. Months went by without any major breakthroughs. The FBI periodically announced new efforts and appealed to the public for assistance. But progress remained invisible to the grieving families who attended every press conference and update meeting. Tom and Patty Williams became staunch advocates for their daughter's case, working with media outlets and LGBTQ+ organizations to keep public attention focused on the unsolved murders. They established a reward fund and pressured law enforcement agencies to continue pursuing every possible lead. Lee's parents launched similar advocacy efforts for Maine, using their daughter's memory to push for improved safety measures in national parks and better resources for investigating hate crimes against LGBTQ+ individuals. As 1996 turned into 1997, then 1998, the case gradually faded from public attention despite the family's relentless efforts. New crimes demanded investigative resources. Media attention shifted to other stories. The FBI maintained its investigation, but acknowledged privately that leads were becoming increasingly scarce. Hope began to dwindle as the case approached its second anniversary without a resolution. The families organized memorial services and continued their advocacy, but the likelihood of identifying Julian and Lee's killer seemed to diminish with each passing month. Then, in early 2001, the investigation received a jolt of new energy when the FBI assigned additional cold case resources to unsolved murders in national parks. Agent Morrison, who had remained personally involved in Julian and Lee's case despite other assignments, was given permission to pursue fresh angles using improved forensic techniques that had been developed during the late 1990s. Morrison's renewed investigation initially focused on improved DNA analysis of biological evidence that had been collected in 1996 but couldn't be properly analyzed using the earlier technology. She also began re-interviewing witnesses and reviewing tips that might have been dismissed or inadequately investigated during the initial inquiry. Most importantly, Morrison began taking a closer look at known violent offenders who had been active in Virginia during 1996. This approach led her to examine the criminal history of Darrell David Rice, a local man whose behavior had drawn the attention of law enforcement for years. Rice had been convicted in 1997 of attempting to abduct a female cyclist at gunpoint in Shenandoah National Park, less than 10 miles from where Julie and Lee had been murdered. The attempted abduction had occurred in August 1997, just over a year after the murders, and involved similar elements: an isolated location, female victims, and extreme violence. Morrison's team discovered that Rice was familiar with the remote areas of Shenandoah where few other people ventured. He had a history of violence against women. He had demonstrated a willingness to commit serious crimes in the same general area where Julian and Lee died. His known behavior patterns fit the psychological profile that behavioral analysts had developed for their killer. Most compelling of all, Rice had been free and unaccounted for during the period when the murders occurred. He lived in the area, knew the terrain intimately, and had no alibi for the relevant dates. In May 1996, federal prosecutors spent months building a case against Rice, while Morrison's team gathered additional evidence. In late 2001, they felt confident enough in their evidence to seek an indictment for hate crime murders. The indictment of Darrell David Rice was publicly announced in early 2002, generating enormous media attention and bringing hope to families who had waited nearly 6 years for justice. Tom Williams broke down in tears when he received the phone call informing him that someone had finally been charged with his daughter's murder. "Thank God," he whispered. "Finally, someone will pay for what they did to Julie and Loy." Federal prosecutors held a press conference to announce the charges and outline their case against Rice. They portrayed him as a violent predator who had specifically targeted Julie and Lee because they were a lesbian couple camping alone in an isolated location. The case seemed strong on paper. Rice knew the area where the murders occurred better than almost anyone else. He had demonstrated a willingness to commit violent crimes against women in similar isolated park locations. His history of violence and weapons charges aligned with the brutal nature of Julie and Lolly's murders. The hiking community and LGBTQ+ advocates responded with cautious relief. Finally, after years of speculation and fear, someone was going to stand trial for the murders that had traumatized so many. But as pretrial proceedings continued through 2002 and into 2003, problems began to surface with the prosecution's case. Rice's defense team, led by experienced criminal attorney Michael Nooff, challenged forensic evidence that seemed to contradict the prosecution's theory. New DNA testing techniques developed since 1996 were now being applied to biological evidence from the crime scene. The results were troubling for prosecutors. DNA profiles recovered from the victims' bodies and clothing consistently excluded Rice as a possible contributor. If Rice was the killer, why didn't his genetic material match evidence from the murder scene? Nooff argued that his client was being prosecuted based on circumstantial evidence and behavioral speculation, rather than solid forensic proof. The prosecution's case, he claimed, relied too heavily on Rice's criminal history and not enough on physical evidence that definitively connected him to the murders. By early 2004, the DNA evidence problems had become insurmountable for federal prosecutors. Advanced testing consistently excluded Rice from biological samples that should have contained the killer's genetic material. The prosecution's case, which had seemed so compelling when based on behavioral analysis and circumstantial evidence, crumbled under forensic scrutiny. In April 2004, federal prosecutors reluctantly withdrew all charges against Daryl David Rice, citing insufficient evidence to proceed to trial. The announcement devastated Julian and Lee's families, who felt betrayed by a system that had offered hope only to cruelly snatch it away. Tom Williams told reporters he felt completely let down by law enforcement officials who had assured him they had the right suspect. They got our hopes up after all these years, and now they're telling us they were wrong. How does that happen? Patty Williams was more direct in her criticism. Somebody made a terrible mistake, and that mistake cost us 8 more years of not knowing who killed our daughter. How many more years will we have to wait? Rice himself remained bitter about the prosecution, claiming his reputation had been permanently damaged by false accusations that had cost him jobs, relationships, and his standing in the community. He eventually moved away from Virginia, seeking anonymity from the unwanted attention that came with being publicly identified as a suspect in such a notorious crime. The dismissal of charges against Rice was a devastating blow to the investigation. Morrison and her team were forced to admit that they had spent years pursuing the wrong suspect. With the real killer still at large, the case reverted to cold status, with even less hope than before. The failed prosecution had consumed enormous resources and generated intense media attention, making it even more difficult to pursue alternative theories without appearing incompetent or desperate. FBI officials faced criticism from families, advocacy groups, and media outlets for their handling of the Rice investigation. How had they become so convinced of his guilt that they pursued an indictment despite forensic evidence that excluded him? Why had DNA testing not been conducted more thoroughly before charges were filed? Years stretched into decades, as the case remained officially open but practically dormant. 2005 became 2010, then 2015, then 2020. Julian and Lee's parents aged visibly under the weight of unresolved grief and unanswered questions. Tom Williams passed away in 2018 without ever learning who had killed his daughter. His final years were marked by declining health and persistent sadness over the injustice that had consumed so much of his family's life. Other family members also died during the long wait for answers. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, and close friends who had loved Julian and Lee passed away without closure, carrying their grief and questions to their graves. The case occasionally received attention from true crime television shows and online forums, where amateur investigators debated theories and suspects, but the official law enforcement investigation remained largely dormant, limited to responding to occasional tips that rarely provided useful new information. Then, in 2021, the FBI Richmond field office made a decision that would finally bring answers to a case that had haunted families and investigators for 25 years. Special Agent Sarah Chun, who had joined the Bureau specifically to work cold cases, was assigned to review unsolved murders in national parks, using advanced forensic techniques developed during the 2010s. Chun was drawn to Julian and Lee's case by the combination of the heinous crime and the preserved biological evidence that might yield results using current DNA analysis capabilities. Chun understood that forensic science had advanced dramatically since 1996, and even since the failed Rice prosecution in the early 2000s. Techniques for extracting and analyzing degraded DNA samples had improved exponentially. Database systems containing genetic profiles from millions of convicted criminals had expanded enormously. Most importantly, the FBI now had resources and protocols specifically designed for applying modern technology to old evidence. Chen's team retrieved evidence boxes that had been stored in climate-controlled facilities for 25 years. The preservation had been excellent, maintaining biological samples that contemporary forensic scientists could analyze using techniques that hadn't existed when the evidence was originally collected. The process required months of meticulous laboratory work. Genetic material had degraded significantly over time, requiring cutting-edge extraction and amplification techniques to develop usable DNA profiles. But Chen's team was patient and methodical, understanding that this might be their last and best opportunity to identify Julian and Lee's killer. In late 2021, analysts successfully created partial but usable DNA fingerprints from key pieces of evidence. The profiles were immediately submitted to CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which now contained genetic information from millions of convicted criminals and arrestees. Nationwide, Chun waited anxiously for results, knowing that a positive match would finally provide the answers that families had sought for 25 years, while a negative result might mean the case would never be solved. On a cold morning in February 2022, Chun received the phone call that changed everything. "Agent Chun, this is the CODIS unit," the lab technician announced. "We have a hit on your Shenandoah case. The DNA matches Walter Leo Jackson, Sr., a convicted rapist from Ohio. The match probability is essentially certain." Chun felt her pulse quicken as she pulled up Jackson's criminal history on her computer screen. Born in 1947, Jackson had compiled a lengthy record of violent crimes against women spanning several decades, including multiple convictions for rape, assault, and related charges. He had served multiple prison sentences in Ohio and neighboring states. Most importantly, Jackson had been free during May 1996, when Julian and Lee were murdered. His known locations and movement patterns placed him in the general area of Virginia during the time frame when the crimes occurred. But there was devastating news as well. Walter Leo Jackson, Sr., had died in an Ohio state prison in August 2018, nearly 4 years before the DNA match was discovered. He would never face trial for Julie and Lee's murders. Justice would have to be satisfied with identification rather than prosecution. Chun spent the following months meticulously verifying the DNA results and researching Jackson's background and movements during 1996. Every piece of additional evidence confirmed their conclusion. Walter Leo Jackson, Sr., was the man who had murdered Julie Williams and Ly Winans in Shenandoah National Park. Jackson's criminal history revealed a pattern of violence that made the Shenandoah murders tragically predictable rather than surprising. He had spent decades preying on women in isolated locations, using similar methods of restraint and brutality that had characterized Julie and Lee's murders. During the spring of 1996, Jackson had been living a transient lifestyle, moving frequently between Ohio and neighboring states to avoid law enforcement attention. He had access to vehicles and often camped or stayed in remote areas where his activities wouldn't attract notice. His presence in Virginia during the relevant time period could be documented through receipts, witness statements, and other evidence that investigators had overlooked during their original focus on local suspects. Most chilling of all, Jackson's other crimes revealed methods and preferences that exactly matched the evidence from Julian and Lee's murders. He consistently targeted women in isolated locations. He used restraints and materials available at crime scenes, rather than bringing obvious weapons. He demonstrated a pattern of extreme sexual violence, followed by murder to eliminate witnesses. The only mystery was why Jackson had left Taj alive when he had killed the dog's human companions. Animal behavior experts theorized that Jackson might have felt no particular animosity toward the dog, or might have considered killing Taj an unnecessary risk that could create additional forensic evidence. In late 2022, Chin began the delicate process of notifying the families about the DNA breakthrough before any public announcement could be made. These conversations would be among the most emotionally complex of her career, bringing answers the families had desperately wanted, while simultaneously delivering the heartbreaking news that the killer had died beyond the reach of justice. Chun personally traveled to Minnesota to meet with Patty Williams, now in her 70s, and the sole surviving parent among both families. The meeting took place in the same house where Julie had grown up, surrounded by photographs and memories of the daughter who had been stolen by Violence 26. Years earlier, when Chun explained the DNA match and Jackson's identity, Patty Williams broke down completely, overwhelmed by emotions that had been building for more than a quarter century. "We finally know," she whispered through tears that seemed to carry decades of grief and frustration. "After all these years, after all the wondering and waiting and false hopes, we finally know who took our beautiful girl away from us." But the relief of knowing was complicated by the reality that Jackson had died in prison, beyond the reach of prosecution or confrontation. The families would have definitive answers about their daughter's killer, but they would never see him face trial or hear him explain his actions. Chun conducted similar notification meetings with Lee's surviving family members in Maine. The conversations were emotionally devastating, but also provided the closure the families had sought for so long. Finally, they could stop wondering about their daughter's killer and begin the process of remembering their lives, rather than focusing primarily on the circumstances of their deaths. The FBI held a press conference on June 1, 2024, exactly 28 years after Julian and Lee's bodies had been discovered, to announce the resolution of the case. Agent Chin stood before the cameras and confirmed what the families had waited 28 years to hear. Through advanced DNA analysis, the FBI has determined that Walter Leo Jackson, Sr., a convicted serial rapist from Ohio, murdered Julian Williams and Laura Winans in Shenandoah National Park in May 1996. The announcement generated intense media coverage across the country. Cable news programs featured the story prominently, often including interviews with family members and investigators who had worked on the case for decades. Online true crime communities dissected every detail of the DNA breakthrough and Jackson's criminal history. Jackson's background provided disturbing insights into how a serial predator had evaded detection for so long. His transient lifestyle and ability to move between states had made it difficult for investigators to track his activities or connect him to crimes in different jurisdictions. His death in prison had prevented the normal processes of investigation and prosecution that might have revealed his connection to other unsolved cases. Within the hiking community, reactions were complex and mixed. Relief that the killer had finally been identified was tempered by anger about the decades-long delay in achieving that identification. Many hikers wondered how different the outcome might have been if advanced DNA analysis had been available and applied more quickly during the original investigation. LGBTQ+ advocacy groups noted that Jackson's other documented crimes had not specifically targeted gay victims, suggesting that Julian and Lee may have been chosen primarily for their vulnerability and isolation rather than their sexual orientation. This finding complicated the hate crime theories that had dominated much of the original investigation and the failed prosecution of Darrell Rice. The revelation raised broader questions about investigative priorities and forensic capabilities. How many other cold cases might be solved if advanced DNA analysis was applied more systematically? To preserved biological evidence? How many families were still waiting for answers that modern technology could provide? Federal officials acknowledged that mistakes had been made during the original investigation and the failed prosecution of Rice, but emphasized the limitations of 1990s forensic technology and investigative resources. The Rice indictment, they insisted, had been based on the best available evidence and investigative techniques of that era. Darrell Rice, now living quietly in another state under an assumed name, issued a statement through his attorney, expressing vindication, but also ongoing bitterness about his treatment by federal prosecutors. The years of public suspicion had permanently damaged his reputation, relationships, and employment opportunities, creating lasting consequences that could never be fully repaired. For Julie and Lolly's families, the revelation brought the complex emotions of finally knowing their daughter's killer, while simultaneously learning that he had escaped earthly justice by dying in prison 3 years earlier. The answers they had desperately needed were finally available, but the confrontation and accountability they had also hoped for would never occur. Patty Williams told reporters she felt grateful and cheated at the same time, grateful for the certainty that came with knowing Jackson's identity, but cheated of the opportunity to see him face trial and hopefully provide explanations for his actions. The case prompted broader discussions about cold case procedures, DNA testing priorities, and resource allocation for unsolved violent crimes. Advocacy groups argued that backlogs of untested evidence represented countless missed opportunities for justice and closure. FBI officials announced policy changes designed to prevent similar delays in future cases. Advanced DNA analysis would be applied more quickly to cold cases involving preserved biological evidence. Interagency cooperation would be improved to ensure that potential suspects weren't overlooked due to jurisdictional boundaries or communication gaps. Julian and Lee's story became a catalyst for these procedural reforms. Their deaths, tragic as they were, had ultimately contributed to improvements in how law enforcement approaches unsolved murders involving genetic evidence. In Shenandoah National Park, rangers installed memorial markers near the trails where Julie and Lee had last been seen alive. The markers honor their memory while educating visitors about backcountry safety and the importance of hiking with proper preparation and communication plans. Annual memorial hikes now take place on the anniversary of their disappearance, organized by hiking clubs and LGBTQ+ organizations. Family members, friends, and strangers moved by their story gathered to walk the trails the two women had loved, transforming spaces of tragedy into places of remembrance and healing. The golden retriever, Taj, lived for several more years after the murders, eventually passing away from natural causes in 2003. Family members who took care of him after Julie's death said he was forever changed by whatever he had witnessed in those woods. He never truly regained his former playful, trusting spirit and remained more cautious and alert for the rest of his life. Both families created scholarship funds in Julie and Lai's name, supporting young people who shared their love for environmental education and outdoor recreation. These programs make sure that their passion for nature and their commitment to making the world a better place continue to inspire new generations of outdoor enthusiasts and environmental advocates. The Julian Williams Memorial Fund provides grants for wilderness education programs in Minnesota schools. Laura Winans Environmental Scholarship supports Maine students who are pursuing careers in environmental science and outdoor education. Both programs have helped hundreds of young people develop the same love for wilderness experiences that had brought such joy to Julie and Lolly's lives. As their story comes to an end, questions remain about how many other cold cases could be solved through the systematic application of modern DNA technology to preserved evidence. Julie and Lolly's families continue to advocate for expanded forensic testing of biological evidence that has remained unanalyzed for decades, knowing that other families are still waiting for the same answers they finally received. Walter Leo Jackson's death in prison prevented the closure that comes from a trial and conviction. But his identification brought the next best thing, certainty. After 28 years of wondering, speculation, false leads, and failed prosecutions, the families finally knew the truth about who had murdered their daughters and why those murders had remained unsolved for so long. The wounds left by Julie and Lolly's murders will never completely heal. Their parents and extended families carry permanent emotional scars from years of uncertainty, grief, and frustration with systems that failed to provide timely justice. But knowing Jackson's identity has allowed healing to begin where only questions had existed for nearly 3 decades. Their story stands as a powerful testament to several enduring truths: that justice delayed is not always justice denied, that a family's persistence and love can outlast bureaucratic inertia and investigative limitations, that scientific advances can eventually illuminate even the darkest secrets, and that advocacy for victims can create positive changes that prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. In Shenandoah's quiet woods, where ancient trees have witnessed countless human dramas over the centuries, Julie Williams and Lai Winans are remembered not primarily as victims of senseless violence, but as young women who embraced life fully, loved each other deeply, and found joy in the wilderness spaces where they felt most connected to something larger than themselves. Their final hiking trip ended in unimaginable tragedy, but their legacy lives on in reformed investigative procedures, memorial trails that educate and inspire other hikers, educational scholarships that support young environmentalists, and the hard-won knowledge that even decades-old secrets eventually find their way into the light. Walter Leo Jackson died believing he had escaped justice for his crimes in Virginia's mountains, but he was wrong. When science, persistence, and love combined to demand truth, that truth emerged. DNA evidence speaks louder than silence. Scientific truth outlasts criminal deception, and love proves stronger than hate. Even when that proof takes 28 years to surface and the reckoning comes after the perpetrator has already faced his own mortality. The trail that Julie and Lai began with such hope and excitement in May 1996 continues today. It is walked by hikers who carry their memory forward and by advocates who ensure their story contributes to a more just world for future generations. Their journey toward justice was longer and more difficult than anyone could have anticipated, but it ultimately reached its destination, the truth. He lived for several years following those horrific murders, eventually succumbing to natural causes in 2003. Those family members who provided care for him in the difficult years after Julie's death described him as a man fundamentally and irrevocably altered by whatever unspeakable horrors he had been forced to witness deep within those woods. He could never fully recapture his former lighthearted and trusting nature, forever remaining more vigilant and cautious throughout the remainder of his days. As a lasting tribute, both families established scholarship funds proudly bearing Julie and Lai's name, with the express purpose of providing crucial support to young individuals who wholeheartedly shared their deep passion for environmental education and the rejuvenating pursuit of outdoor recreation. These vital programs serve as an enduring testament, ensuring that their shared ardor for the natural world and their unwavering commitment to forging a better world continue to ignite the imaginations and fuel the ambitions of countless future generations of dedicated outdoor enthusiasts and tireless environmental advocates. Specifically, the Julian Williams Memorial Fund actively provides essential grants for innovative wilderness education programs within Minnesota schools, while the Laura Winan Environmental Scholarship lends crucial support to Maine students diligently pursuing promising careers in both environmental science and outdoor education. Collectively, these two invaluable programs have already profoundly impacted the lives of hundreds of young people, helping them to cultivate and nurture that very same deep love and appreciation for transformative wilderness experiences that had previously brought immeasurable joy and fulfillment to both Julie and Lolly's all too brief lives. As this profoundly moving story finally draws to its inevitable conclusion, a host of important questions still linger in the air, primarily concerning just how many other unsolved cold cases could potentially be successfully cracked through the systematic and widespread application of cutting-edge modern DNA technology to meticulously preserved evidence. Driven by an unwavering determination, Julie and Lolly's families have tirelessly continued their relentless advocacy for the expanded and more comprehensive forensic testing of all biological evidence that has sadly remained unanalyzed and neglected for far too many decades, all while holding fast to the powerful conviction that countless other grieving families are still desperately awaiting the same long-overdue answers that they themselves have finally and gratefully received. The unfortunate death of Walter Leo Jackson, while still incarcerated in prison, sadly prevented the sense of closure that can only truly come from a full and fair trial followed by a just conviction. However, his definitive identification as the perpetrator ultimately provided the next best thing: absolute certainty. After enduring a seemingly endless 28 years characterized by agonizing wondering, unfounded speculation, misleading false leads, and frustratingly failed prosecutions, both families were finally and definitively granted access to the full and unvarnished truth regarding exactly who had brutally murdered their beloved daughters, and precisely why those heinous murders had remained tragically unsolved for such an unconscionably long period of time. The deep and lasting wounds left by Julie and Lolly senseless murders will unfortunately never completely heal. Their devoted parents and extended families will undoubtedly continue to carry the heavy burden of permanent emotional scars inflicted by countless years of torturous uncertainty, overwhelming grief, and profound frustration with flawed systems that demonstrably failed to provide timely justice. However, the long-awaited revelation of Jackson's true identity has at long last allowed the arduous process of healing to slowly begin in the very place where only unanswered questions had frustratingly existed for nearly 3 long and agonizing decades. Their heartbreaking story stands as a truly powerful and enduring testament to several timeless truths: that justice delayed is most assuredly not always justice denied, that a family's unwavering persistence and unconditional love can inevitably outlast even the most entrenched bureaucratic inertia and the most daunting investigative limitations, that groundbreaking scientific advances can ultimately illuminate even the most deeply buried and carefully concealed secrets, and that dedicated advocacy for victims can effectively create positive and lasting changes that prevent other innocent families from tragically experiencing similar heart-wrenching ordeals. Within the quiet and serene woods of Shenandoah, where ancient and venerable trees have silently witnessed countless human dramas unfold across the ages, Julie Williams and Lai Winans are most fondly remembered not merely as the unfortunate victims of senseless violence, but instead as vibrant young women who wholeheartedly embraced life to its fullest extent, loved each other unconditionally and deeply, and found immeasurable joy and profound peace in the vast wilderness spaces where they invariably felt most intimately connected to something far grander and more significant than themselves. Their final and fateful hiking trip tragically ended in unimaginable sorrow and pain. But their enduring legacy lives on in thoroughly reformed investigative procedures, in beautifully designed memorial trails that effectively educate and deeply inspire other hikers, in thoughtfully established educational scholarships that passionately support budding young environmentalists, and in the hard-won and invaluable knowledge that even the most carefully guarded, decades-old secrets will inevitably find their way into the illuminating light of day. Walter Leo Jackson tragically died with the firm belief that he had successfully escaped justice for his unspeakable and boundless love coalesce to demand truth. That truth will invariably and ultimately emerge. Compelling DNA evidence will always speak louder than deceptive silence. Impartial scientific truth will inevitably outlast malicious criminal deception. An enduring love will always prove to be stronger than hate, even when that definitive proof takes as long as 28 years to finally surface, and that final reckoning only comes after the perpetrator himself has already faced the unavoidable reality of his own inescapable mortality. The challenging trail that Julian Lai so bravely began with such palpable hope and unbridled excitement back in May of 1996 continues to be walked to this very day, not only by the countless hikers who proudly carry their precious memory forward, but also by the dedicated advocates who tirelessly ensure that their poignant story continues to contribute to a far more just and equitable world for all future generations to come. Their arduous journey toward the ultimate realization of justice was undoubtedly far longer and infinitely more difficult than anyone could have possibly anticipated, but it undeniably and triumphantly reached its final destination, the unassailable and liberating truth. In May of 1996, Julie Williams and Lai Winans packed their backpacks, anticipating what should have been a liberating week in Virginia's Shenandoah National Park. Two young women deeply in love with the outdoors, they brought along their golden retriever, Taj, and visions of the trails that lay ahead. Their families were expecting to hear from them by May 28th. Those calls never happened. When Taj wandered back alone on May 30th, hope quickly turned to fear. Days later, searchers tragically discovered Julie and Lai's bodies near Skyline Drive. They had been bound, gagged, and brutally murdered, a discovery that shattered